The Jaguar by Ted Hughes is a really interesting poem. I really enjoyed reading it. It reminded me a lot of times that I've been to zoos and I've looked at kind of wild animals and how they behave. I remember going to Bristol Zoo when I was living in Bristol at university, and there was these Asiatic lions who were really endangered in the wild, but they had some of them that they were trying to breed so that they could rewild them and increase the kind of wild population. And they're really, really beautiful animals, and they used to just kind of walk around. They're very comfortable with people, so you'd be able to kind of just sit next to them pretty much and watch them. And it was a really amazing experience. So before we actually jump into this one, I want you to just think about your own experience with wild animals. Ideally, some kind of wild cat, like a lion or a tiger, or a jaguar or a panther, cheetah. So if you've ever seen and sat and watched a wild cat, you can jot down a couple of your own experiences or memories of that. If you've never seen a wild cat, try and do it for any other wild animal that you might have seen. And if you've never seen any kind of wild animal, do it for a cat or a dog that you've noticed, although cats and dogs generally are domestic, so they don't quite have the same kind of personality, I suppose, as wild animals. So you want to think about, where did you see this animal and what were your thoughts and your reactions to the animal? And that will help you get into the mindset of the speaker in this poem, because that's basically what the story of the poem is. So you can pause me and write a few notes, and when you've done that, we'll jump into the analysis of the poem. So the poem itself is still in copyright. I can't read it aloud for you, but I recommend just pausing again and reading it aloud to yourself, just to make sure that you kind of, get the imagery of the poem, where you get the general feeling of the poem before we jump into what's going on in the analysis. There's some vocabulary here as well, so just have a quick look through that so that you understand what the main kind of words are, or the more difficult words of the poem would be. It's a very kind of wild, animalistic poem from the offset. You can see there it starts with the apes yawn and adore their fleas in the sun. The parrots shriek as if they're on fire, or strut like cheap tarts to attract the stroller with the nut. So we're placed immediately into the context of a zoo with all of these animals that normally wouldn't really live like this together, just kind of placed in cages. You might have your own ethical beliefs about zoos, whether you agree with them or not. I always get into a really big argument with my grandma about this, because she hates zoos and she refuses to ever go to one, and she thinks they're evil. My brother actually is similar. And I personally I think if zoos are done right, they actually have a lot of potential for doing good in terms of conservation, like wildlife conservation and the preservation of species and raising awareness of endangered animals and that kind of thing. So I think that zoos, if they're calibrated in the right way, can do really well. And if they're kind of not run properly, then they're terrible. That's my personal ethical stance on zoos. But yeah, a lot of people just kind of full on boycott zoos. I think if you fully boycott a zoo, then you can't really contribute to the good potential of what zoos can do. That's sort of how I see it. But yeah, you can see here that the animals are kind of behaving not exactly in this wild way. Like the apes are sort of bored. They don't really have anything to do. The parrots sort of make noises as if they're on fire, and then they strut around, reacting to the people who are watching them. So the tension of wildness and domesticity, or like the human world and the natural world, is already present from those opening images. We can see that these animals are not behaving exactly how they would in the wild. So it brings up the theme of captivity and wildness there as well. So there's a little translation on the left-hand side, I'll try and get it all on the same page. There we go. Yeah, a little translation on the left-hand side of what's going on. So if you're not quite sure of the full story, I would recommend reading this in detail. You can also download these documents from the Scribbly page. So we always have full courses up on scribbly.com. So you can always go there for anything if you want to download it and use it in any way. So I'll just give you a kind of brief overview, but feel free to read through in your own time if you need a bit more detail. So there's monkeys, animals, chimps. They're yawning. The parrots are squawking and kind of bored. And the tiger and lion, who are actually other predatory wildcats, they're actually kind of lazy and tired. They're lying in the sun. The snake looks like a fossil because it's just kind of been sat there coiled up for so long. So there's all these animals and they're all really bored and tired and kind of listless, like there's nothing really for them to do. Again, that theme of captivity when wild animals are caged, sort of the psychology that they might adopt at that point. So yeah, the cages, a lot of them seem empty because the animals are kind of just hiding, and sleeping animals kind of smell, and the cages sort of smell of those as well. So there's this feeling of bathos, we could say, anticlimax. There's a sense that it's not as exciting or as fun for the humans as it should be. These animals are not, performing as they should for humans. Again, Hughes is making us think about that tension between human, kind of the human world and the wild world or civilization and savagery, whether it is correct that we should expect for these animals to perform for us that way. He's very, I don't know how you say it, like he's really obsessed with wildness and the wild nature that's present in humans, and then the wild natural animal kingdom and how it's quite brutal but also very honest and real. And he tries to capture that a lot in his poetry. So from when he was young, he always was fascinated by the wild, the world of nature. So I feel like with this poem, he's got a bit of a disdain maybe for zoos himself. He doesn't quite agree with the ethics of it, or he doesn't really like the fact that humans just kind of put animals in cages. But he has what we call an epiphany, so this shocking moment where something new is revealed. So the jaguar is not like the other animals. People are running past all of these cages to join a crowd, and there's an entire crowd that is mesmerized by this very, very powerful jaguar that is kind of acting more wild and more kind of violent and crazy than the other animals in the zoo, more like how we might expect wild natural beings to react if they were caged. So he's very, very powerful, to the point where the speaker feels like there's actually no cage for him. He's not really, his presence and his energy and his wildness and his majesty and the kind of shock and awe that people feel at his beauty goes far beyond the fact that he's just an animal in the cage. There's something about his soul that is far more powerful like that. He's like a visionary in a prison cell, so he's like a genius, prophet, spiritual person who has an amazing kind of complex, beautiful mind. If you lock them in a prison, the physical confines of that prison is not really going to contain them because their mind is so kind of beyond the physical world. So the jaguar is like that type of person. He strides around, and as he walks, that represents wildernesses of freedom. So again, this tension between the themes of freedom and captivity there. The world bends to him, not he bends to the world. So he's so powerful, he's attracted the energy of all of the humans. And you might think about how the humans are behaving a little like animals there, and the jaguar is standing, with his own power. in this moment. It's a very interesting interplay between humans and animals that goes on throughout this poem. So a little bit more about the speaker. He's a zoo visitor. He's a person who really, has, for whatever reason, gone to the zoo. And he's kind of bored. He's sort of not really interested. The animals aren't interested in him. He's not particularly interested in them. Seems like there's a sense of like uneasiness or kind of disappointment maybe there. But then, yeah, the jaguar really creates a volta, creates a turning point in the feeling of the poem where it shifts and suddenly, it's this powerful, amazing moment. So, this jaguar, it represents the raw power of nature itself. It's, as a being, the jaguar can't be contained. It's something to do with the energy of that jaguar. The power of that jaguar is not really confinable and reducible to, a box in a zoo, which is really interesting, I think, as a concept. So yeah, there's a lot of language techniques here. There are also more in the poem, so this is just a kind of overview of some of them. So feel free to look at your own techniques as well in the poems. But yeah, you can see that he uses a range of different poetic devices to sort of paint a more vivid and detailed picture of the zoo. It's actually full of precise imagery, so it might be a good idea if you have time to just go through and underline anything that you think is quite a powerful image that creates a big impression in your mind, like almost as if you can imagine it very clearly. And with imagery, I've picked up on visual imagery here, but you can also find auditory imagery where the parrot's squawking, and a range of other types of imagery as well. There's also, a lot of interesting uses of consonants or sibilants. So if you look on the level of individual letters even and what they're doing in the poem, that can give you a lot of meaning that you could analyze in an essay. There's also this task which I think is quite important to do, so I don't quite have time to cover it. Sorry, my voice is going. I don't quite have time to cover it here because we have loads of stuff to get through, but the sublime is an important idea, I think, to this poem. So if you're interested in pushing your analysis further, I'd recommend reading about the sublime and romantic poetry and what the idea of the sublime is. And once you understand what that term means, you can spend some time looking at this poem and trying to figure out how does that connect to this poem. So structurally as well, it's quite interesting that there's no kind of clear meter, but there is a regular structure of the stanzas. So there's 5 stanzas in total. They're all 4 lines, so they're quatrains. So for me, that represents the tension between chaos and order, the tension between the civilized human world and the kind of raw, unchecked natural world. The use of the quatrains might symbolize something like the way that humans try to compartmentalize nature in order to understand it properly, and the freeform lack of regular meter might then show the sort of fluidity or kind of chaos of nature that pushes back against that structure. So it's, again, all about that interplay between humans and nature and the civilized world and the wild world. The rhyme scheme, there's a lot of different interesting complex rhymes in the poem, but no set rhyme scheme. So spend some time going through and kind of trying to think of which words connect in terms of rhyme or even half rhyme, because those words deliberately are going to be emphasized by the poet, so they'll have a specific meaning. So whenever you see a certain use of rhyme, especially irregular rhyme, you can think about why did Hughes want to emphasize that? Why did the poet want to emphasize that? So there's a little bit of detail on some of the rhymes here, but again, you can go more into the poem with your own thoughts as well. Yeah, so we've got a lot of context for this one. I generally, with all of the Hughes lessons that I'm doing at the moment, I'm just giving you a lot of context, partly because I love Ted Hughes and he's amazing, and I know loads about him because I spent years reading his stuff. And actually, about a year ago, I went and did a writing course at Ted Hughes's house, which is now owned by a writing foundation, so you can go stay there and do writing. So yeah, I'm a huge fangirl, basically. But also I think it's useful for you to help understand the poem, because Hughes is quite a weird person. He has his own sort of world that he lives in, almost his own sets of beliefs and ideas about humanity and nature, and even the cosmos. He's got weird sense of spirituality, very weird personal beliefs. He doesn't really fit into a box with his thoughts and ideas on the world. So if you understand him quite well, then you'll really see, what the poems are about. But if you try and just read the poem and understand what he means by just reading one poem, it's not really going to help you. So the context is very important for Hughes. So yeah, there's a really amazing poetry collection that he wrote called The Hawk in the Rain. I love this one. It's actually his debut collection, so his first collection. The Jaguar was part of this. It was very different from other poetry books that came out at the time. And, The Hawk in the Rain, the title of that whole collection is animal focused, nature focused. So you can see that nature is really one of his giant key themes that he's always comfortable with in his poetry. He also married another absolutely brilliant poet, one of my favourite poets ever, Sylvia Plath. She kind of, always supported him and he supported her, and he's a little bit further along in his career when they married than she was as well. But she said that, his poetry is extremely rich and powerful. So you might think about, the rich imagery or the power and the potential of this poem, how it kind of shifts our minds when we start thinking about maybe the ethics of zoos, or the way that humans interact with nature, or the way that humans actually behave like animals sometimes, because the way that the crowd behaves in the presence of the jaguar is as if the jaguar has all the power and the humans are just reduced to copying each other, similar to apes. So yeah, there's a lot of complex kind of ideas to do with humans, nature, and the natural world, and the human world embedded in there, which are all kind of present in the rich and powerful imagery. So yeah, animals for him also reflect the human psyche. They kind of represent different elements of our own soul, because for Hughes, if you look into nature and you really understand the sort of truth of how nature works, you actually uncover deeper truths about the human mind or the human soul as well, because he saw us as actually essentially animals and connected still from nature. So it's a really interesting debate that you can take part in. It's an important thing to decide, I think, in your life, how animal you think you are, or how kind of refined and civilized away from animal tendencies you feel you are as an individual, and then how you feel society is as a whole. So there's a spectrum of different opinions that different writers take over time on that debate. So you could think that we're just pretending to be civilized because we build houses and societies, and actually if you strip us back down to our core essential nature, we are still animals, and we're not really that far removed from the animals that we evolved from. But you can also think that we're very far removed, and that we create a very safe bubble for ourselves with society, which makes us behave and experience the world very differently from if we were wild. So it's sort of like a nature-nurture debate as well that goes on there. So for Hughes, he feels we are still quite wild in our core, and if we get in touch with that, we understand ourselves better, and we're more respectful of human nature, and also nature in general, because we see ourselves as an extension of it. Whereas if we think of ourselves as separate from nature, that's when we do damage to the natural world and the environment, and also to ourselves. I think personally, I really agree with this, and it's one reason why I really like Hughes's poetry. So yeah, there's this argument that there's these kind of ancient powers that the world functions on. And if you sit and watch something like a very powerful jaguar, you can kind of tap into and get in touch with that sort of ancient power. And modern society frequently ignores that type of power, or we just kind of create a bubble around ourselves. So we're too protected from that kind of raw, wild power that is part of the world around us. So, yeah, you can kind of think about jaguars, what they might represent if they're a representation of nature. And there's also this poem here called The Tiger by William Blake. I really, really recommend reading this one. I feel like Hughes read The Tiger and then had his own experience really similar to that, and then just wrote his own poem, which was The Jaguar. So for me, his Jaguar is a huge continuation of William Blake's Tiger. William Blake is a romantic poet as well. I kind of mentioned those earlier briefly. So yeah, the tiger, again, it's just about the majesty and the power of a tiger, how amazing a tiger is and how terrifying and how on earth something like a tiger could exist. If you kind of break a tiger down into its parts, it's all really magical and wondrous. So yeah, have a look at William Blake's Tiger. Compare and contrast that with the jaguar. If you have time, Hughes also wrote a few more poems about jaguars because he was really into them. So he wrote Jaguar Skin, looking specifically at the skin of a jaguar. Also Second Look at a Jaguar, which is like revisiting the topic of a jaguar. So you might compare and contrast this poem here with those other two poems that Hughes wrote about the jaguar. There's also a really amazing poem by Rilke called The Panther. And if you're really into this idea, obviously you can tell because I've kind of gone on a bit of a spiral with it myself. But yeah, if you're super into this idea of nature and how that power of nature is present within animals, if you observe the animal kingdom, then you might even read and compare and contrast all of those poems together because they're all really talking about a very similar topic and providing different angles and perspectives there. So, yeah, very interesting context points. All of these contextual points and contextual tasks are going to help you understand the poem in even more detail. So we're going to just look a little bit at the attitudes just to finish here. So attitudes are the beliefs or opinions present in the poem. I've tried to kind of give you a flavour of this the whole way through anyway, but you'll probably see it more obviously here if I kind of go into them precisely. So the first one is that the jaguar is distinctive. A lot of those animals are not really behaving like wild animals, but the jaguar, something about him. And we don't know if it's Hughes praising jaguars rather than parrots or lions, or if it's actually this particular jaguar, something about him refuses to be domesticated or refuses to give in to his captivity. So we can't tell whether it's all jaguars or just specifically this one, but something about the jaguar in the poem is different from the other animals in the zoo. He's not lazy, he's not given in to his captivity, he's not even contained by the captivity. He has so much kind of energy around him that it draws in a huge crowd, and he has this kind of restlessness to him. And so the jaguar is a symbol of complex ancient powers, ancient natural powers. And there's a natural comparison between the way humans are behaving, in a crowd. I don't know if you've ever been had this feeling. I've had it quite a lot where I'm just sort of like, on a tram or a bus or something, or a train, and there's just tons of people around you and everyone's sort of behaving all in the same way and everyone's quite mindless, and you're just like, I don't know, like you think everyone's kind of behaving in this kind of very, very human way that's completely switched off from their surroundings or what's going on. They're just waiting until they can switch their brain on again once they've arrived at work or arrived at home, wherever they are. And that kind of mindlessness where people just behave a certain way in crowds, I think is very present in this poem because of the way that people are just crowding around this jaguar, and they're almost like running to become part of that crowd, whereas the jaguar stands alone in his own power. There's also some attitudes about freedom in general, so we can take this to be a more political poem about freedom and captivity. It's not necessarily only about animals or the natural world. So that line where he's talking about the visionary in his cell, it's a very small, subtle hint that maybe this poem is about something more than just, wild animals that are in cages. So we have this feeling like, there's no cage to this jaguar any more than to a visionary in his cell. So it's a sense that if a person is a visionary, if they're a really powerful person with an extremely powerful mind, the mind has the ability to go beyond any boundaries or confines that, exist in our physical world. So it's quite a difficult idea, but it's a very philosophical or spiritual idea that is more about freedom in general than it is about animals. So it's suggesting that all humans actually have this capacity as well to break out of any boundaries or structures that oppress them or contain them. So it could be about social freedom or political freedom from oppression as well. Yeah, so I was trying to figure out, what zoo this was, and I think because I found this kind of interview with them, they were talking about taking Frida, their daughter Frida, to the zoo. So I think this is actually like cut off slightly, so I need to fix that on the page. But yeah, this point anyway is an interview with Hughes and Plath, and they're talking about their daughter and taking their daughter to the zoo. I think at that time they live in London, so if you wanted to kind of really imagine what zoo this is, you could look up some pictures of London Zoo, especially London Zoo back in the 60s, and that should give you an idea. I think zoos nowadays are a lot better than they used to be as well. They try and create more of a natural environment for animals. Good. So yeah, you can explore your own ethics on zoos here with this task as well. And then when you're ready, you can also explore some themes, try out some exercises, and also some essay questions. So yeah, I love this poem. I think it's amazing, and I find it really thought-provoking and interesting and complex. So hopefully it's understandable to you, and hopefully it's kind of inspired you or made you think in different ways as well about all of the themes that exist here. So thank you very much for listening. Go to scribbly.com if you need more help with revision or anything to do with the Hughes stuff in particular, because we have a whole course of Hughes stuff on there. And yeah, I'll see you guys soon in a future lesson. Bye for now.